Resuming debate, the honourable member for Regina Lewvan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be splitting my time with my honourable colleague for Burnaby South. Yesterday, like every Thursday, there was a peace vigil in downtown Regina. Activists distributed literature warning against endless war in Iraq and Syria. Some of those activists, like Florence Stratton, are adamantly nonpartisan. Others, like Paul Gingrich and Stephen Moore, worked hard on my election campaign, and I would like to thank them for their support. Now, whether we agree with a particular political party or not, the peace movement in Regina and around the world has been warning against misguided Western intervention in the Middle East for years, and I believe that this House should listen. Some of the new MPs that occupy these fold-down seats on the outer reaches of the House were born at around the time that the Soviets started fighting in Afghanistan. And what did the West do in response? We started funding and arming the Mujahideen, which led to the Taliban taking over Afghanistan, which really enabled the September 11th terrorist attack and ultimately entangled us in a prolonged war in Afghanistan with decidedly mixed results. Also in the wake of the September 11th attacks, the Bush administration decided to invade Iraq on the false pretext of weapons of mass destruction. And of course, Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives were clamoring for Canada to participate in this invasion. And although Prime Minister Chrétien ultimately decided to keep Canada out, it's worth remembering that Paul Martin and many other Liberals were also agitating for Canada to engage in that invasion. I'm very proud of the fact that it was only Jack Layton and the NDP that provided a consistent and credible voice against that misguided war. Now, after years of death and destruction, what has been accomplished? Well, Western countries validated the jihadist narrative that we are crusaders who want to invade Muslim countries. We created a power vacuum in Iraq, which was filled by ISIS. We sent large quantities of arms to Iraq, many of which fell into the hands of ISIS. We laid off the former officers of Saddam Hussein's army, many of whom are now leading the ISIS army. In Syria, we see a somewhat similar pattern more recently. Western countries and allied Gulf monarchies decided to fund and arm rebels against President Assad. But most of the rebel groups in Syria are jihadist organizations that are not much different than ISIS. Unsurprisingly, Mr. Speaker, many of the weapons and many of the funds sent to the Syrian opposition ended up in the hands of ISIS. So we're now left with a situation where ISIS controls large parts of both Iraq and Syria. And what solutions have been proposed in this House? Well, we've heard calls for more bombing. We've also heard calls for more arms to the Kurds. What could possibly go wrong, Mr. Speaker? Now, at least the Conservatives have been consistent in constantly calling for bombing of the Middle East. And it seems that they hope that democratic governments will magically rise like a phoenix out of the embers of that bombing, Mr. Speaker. But the Liberals campaigned against bombing. The Liberals campaigned against Canada playing a combat role. But being Liberals, they can't just make a progressive promise and then follow through on it. They have to play both sides of the issue. I think, Mr. Speaker, it's in their DNA to campaign from the left and then govern from the right. So today, we're looking at a motion to keep their election promise to end bombing, but then to send in ground troops. And, Mr. Speaker, you won't often hear the government describe it that way, but I was interested to hear the Minister of Defense say almost exactly that just now in question period. The Liberals can't say that they are ending Canada's military mission. They won't admit that they are expanding Canada's military mission, so instead they say they are refocusing Canada's military mission. It's a verb we've heard from the Prime Minister, and it's a verb we heard from the previous speaker, the honourable member for Don Valley East. But it's an odd choice of verb, Mr. Speaker, because this motion has absolutely no focus. In fact, I would go so far as to suggest that this motion is the opposite of focus. We have no clear objective, we have no way to measure success, and of course we have no exit strategy. So what should actually be done to counter ISIS? Well, first of all, Canada should be using diplomacy to try to negotiate a peaceful settlement, and that will be very difficult to do if we are directly engaged in the fighting. Second of all, Canada should be stopping the flow of arms to the Middle East. One way of doing that would be to sign the UN Arms Trade Treaty. I'm concerned, Mr. Speaker, that the government's plan to arm the Kurds carries great risks of escalation. I'm also concerned that arms that we may sell to Saudi Arabia will likely end up in the wrong hands. Third, Canada needs to stop the flow of foreign fighters into the Middle East, and that means real engagement with our Muslim community and a strong de-radicalization program. Mr. Speaker, those are some concrete steps that we could take to counter ISIS. Now, I don't have a perfect or complete solution to the problems of the Middle East, but I do believe that we need to stop making those problems worse. So I ask this House to vote against the Conservative amendment, to vote against the Liberal motion, and to vote for peace. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions et commentaires?
Questions and comments.
Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And you know, it's interesting listening to the member maybe even attempt to twist or possibly even rewrite history. There's Canadians widely supported Prime Minister Chrétien's approach with Iraq. And there is, history will clearly indicate that the Liberal government did not participate in Iraq. The member might want to try to portray divisions within a caucus, and he should get his own caucus somewhat united on different issues before he tries to portray or rewrite history. You know, when you take a look at what the Liberal motion is all about, we are very different than the New Democrats. The New Democrats talk a lot about an exit strategy. Their exit strategy is a no-entry strategy, Mr. Speaker. They don't recognize that Canada does have a leadership role in the world to play in combating terrorism. My question to the member is very specific. Does the NDP believe that they should be using the Canadian forces in any way whatsoever, and if so, how, in combating terrorism in the world?
The honourable member for Regina Lewvan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would agree with the member for Winnipeg North that Prime Minister Chrétien thankfully did keep our country out of the 2003 invasion of Iraq. I was one of the Canadians who supported his approach. All I noted in my remarks is that Paul Martin and various other Liberals were clamoring for Canada to participate in that invasion. So as is so often the case, the Liberals were kind of on both sides of the issue, and I don't necessarily regard them as being a consistent voice for peace in this House. The member for Winnipeg North also talked about the NDP's exit strategy being a no-entry strategy. That's true, Mr. Speaker. We don't think we should get involved unless we have a clear path to success and a clear way of getting out of it. And in saying that, the member for Winnipeg North avoided, yet again, actually explaining what the government's exit strategy is, which leads me to believe that they don't have one. And yes, finally, the NDP very much is supportive of using the armed forces to defend our country against terrorism and other threats, but we don't think that dropping more bombs or having greater military intervention in Iraq and Syria is an effective way of doing that, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Montmagny, Lille, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning I put a question to my colleague who made a very important speech on this matter, and I asked him after the meetings that he held with the NATO colleagues in past weeks what the perception of Canada was by our allies on this matter. And his response was that our allies are very disappointed with Canada's stance, with the current government's stance on the military intervention and the withdrawal of our CF-18s. So I'd like to ask my colleague, how does he interpret the fact that all our partners think that we are not participating enough in this intervention? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think that it's fine that our allies have different positions on this issue. I find that the Conservatives are using examples where our allies are critical of our position. Sometimes the Liberals use quotes from allies who say that our government is doing good things. So I don't think that's really the right evaluation to use. I think that we really have to determine what is going to work in the Middle East, what is going to work to achieve peace, and that is really the purpose of my speech. Thank you again.
Resuming debate, the honourable member.